Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another video of Deliq Theology. I am Deliq. I am just reading through I guess, like just some scripture and talking about soteriology and stuff. And I remembered coming across 2 Corinthians chapters 3 and 4 and what they're about. And I remember when I was talking to someone who actually was an Arminian. Actually, I think it might have been Dan Chapa, or no, I don't think it's Dan Chapa. I think it was somebody else whoever is the Arminians handle on Twitter X. And so I remember we were talking about that one, and he, to be honest, he kind of stumped me on it because he brought up chapter 4. And in chapter 4, we were talking about whether someone, whether prevenient grace is true, or some kind of work of the Spirit on the heart before, or prior to conversion, that is separate from hearing the news of the gospel. It is like a, some kind of work of the Spirit on the heart. It's not specified because there can be many different ways, but the some kind of work of the Spirit on the heart in order to, perhaps partially regenerate someone, or to enable them to believe. And so that was his position as an Arminian. I believe that's typically the Arminian position, maybe the classical Arminian, I'm not sure. But whatever it is, it's some kind of prevenient grace is what they call it. And so I, as somebody who probably somewhere fits in with the provisionist camp, honestly, sometimes I feel like I'm an Arminian, other times I feel like I'm a provisionist. I wanted to kind of dive deeper into this a little bit more, and figure out what was going on with it. So let's go ahead and read 2 Corinthians chapter 4. So this is Paul at this point talking about the ministry and how they, that they're trying to have good practices. Basically, they're not trying to be deceitful. And when they're talking to people, what exactly is their response? Are they responding in light of in faith, or are they not? He doesn't use all of these words, but I'm just kind of summarizing it in a way that's understandable. So, but yeah, let me go ahead and read it real quick. So, starting from verse 1 of chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world, usually that's talking about Satan, is what most people are going to look at that, and it's lowercase g, and all that. But most people interpret that as Satan, who's the God of this world. In their case, the ones who are perishing is what they're talking about. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So that's verses 1 through 6. And the primary focus is on verse 4, where it says the God of this world. So I'm just going to shorten that to Satan. Satan has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So Satan is according to this verse, Satan is blinding the minds of the unbelievers in order to prevent them from believing, right? To keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. And so if that's the takeaway from this passage. Typically, if you read it, I don't, I think it's pretty clear cut and dry. Like I don't think that needs to be qualified in any kind of way. So, at least at the moment. Now, perhaps there's something deeper going on, but I think that this, generally speaking, should be easy to read, right? Satan is blinding the minds of the unbelievers. Now, the question is, are they blinding? Is Satan blinding the minds of the unbelievers before or after they don't believe? Like if somebody's presented the gospel, is Satan already blinding them before they can even see it, right? Or is it a perpetual thing that you're born with blinders on from Satan, and you can never see the light of the gospel? And so those are some questions, right, that arise from that. And so I kind of wanted to dig deeper into that, because the solution of the Arminian, at least according to who I was speaking to, the Arminians is the name of his Twitter handle. The solution from an Arminian is typically going to be a regenerating or partial regeneration or prevenient grace in this case, where basically it's like some kind of temporary solution to, or perhaps like basically something to remove those blinders, something to remove that blindness, to just allow somebody to see a little bit of light, and that is what they would say is a work of the Spirit in some kind of way. Now, if you're a Calvinist, the solution to this is just regeneration, and you're just going to say like, hey, God fully removes those blinders, and you are fully regenerated. You can see all of the light, and now you can believe. That is the solution for the Calvinist. I can say, if I was to give one to the Calvinist, I would say that's an actual easy solution. The Arminian is kind of like, it's like a partial kind of thing, like or at least like a temporary kind of thing. Basically, they have a chance, at least in order to respond to the gospel, despite initially being blinded, or whatever it is. That seems to be the case. Now, somebody can correct me if that's a straw man, but I think it's something like that, right? And so now what I'm going to do is go back to read chapter 3. And the reason why I do this is because there seems to be, if the natural reading of chapter 4, the natural takeaway from chapter 4, from verse 4 of chapter 4 is exactly as we think that it is initially, then there should be nothing to contradict that. However, I feel like I came across something that seemed to contradict that natural reading. So we have to do something, right? We have to reconcile these things, because Paul is saying whatever he's saying in chapter 4, literally right after what he said in chapter 3. So I think we just gotta figure out what's going on, right? So let me get to it. I'm gonna start, and let's say, you know what? I'll just start from verse 1. I know it's a lot to read, but I don't mind doing it, right? Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? So this is Paul, like, just talking about he wants to justify his ministry. Like he's saying like, am I qualified to speak to you or not, basically? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So he's making kind of a callback to the stone tablets that they used to use to talk about the law. He's kind of bringing up that imagery, is essentially to say, in order to kind of say that if there's something written on your hearts by the Spirit, in order to tell you that what basically like the Spirit is testifying to you that what they're saying is true, that what all of the apostles, Paul and whoever else, is saying is true. So I think that's my interpretation of that. But such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And when he's talking about the letter right there, he's talking about the law. Like the law, that's why he referred to the stone tablets of the law, like the stone tablets, because that's a reference to the law. And he's talking about a letter. That letter, like it's written words, is a letter. And he's saying the letter kills. Paul has spoken in different areas, in different parts of his letters before, that the law brings death, but the Spirit gives life. The reason why the law kills, the law brings death, is because when you are in the flesh and you don't, you cannot. This is talking about Romans chapter 7. This is actually Romans chapter 7, a cross reference. If you are in the flesh, you cannot obey the law perfectly, right? So you can't really live up to the law by yourself. Anyways, so he's saying that the Spirit gives life, and so that is something to consider. It seems to me that he's speaking about Jews in this case, where he's saying, like, he's giving imagery about the law, he's giving imagery about a letter, and also referring to the Spirit. And so he seems to be speaking to Jews, or at least qualifying himself, in order to be able to speak about this stuff, because the Spirit is giving life, and he's able to speak from the Spirit and stuff like that. So now, I could be wrong here. That's okay. That's not the point of this entire thing, right? Verse 7, now if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness much far exceeded in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all, because of the glory that surpasses it. So, again, he's talking about the law versus the Spirit. The law and the Spirit, the letter and the Spirit in this case. Verse 11, for if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more what is permanent have glory. So the Spirit is permanent, the law is not permanent. The law is just temporary, right? Since we have such a hope, we are very bold, not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. So I think that part is honestly hard to interpret. I'm not fully understanding that one. I'll just be honest. Moses putting a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. I think he's talking about saying that what is being brought to an end is the law. I think he's saying that because Paul does speak a lot about the law being abolished or being brought to an end or brought to completion by Christ. Like Jesus even said himself that he didn't come to abolish law but to fulfill it. A lot of times it's just language to say, hey, no more law. Now we have spirit. Now we have grace. So I think that's something to consider, right? So now let's keep on. Verse 12. Oh, sorry. Verse 14. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the old covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Okay, so let's pause right here for just a second. In verse 4 of chapter 4, he mentions a veil, which is why, like, the first time a veil is mentioned is clearly in chapter 3. So we have to interpret what chapter 4 means based on how he used it in chapter 3, right? Because chapter 3 it's mentioned first, and so chapter 3. I mean, sometimes there's clarification later on about what a word is being used for, but in this case, it seems like one is going to interpret the other. That's all I know. One is going to clarify or interpret the other. I think that's just how it's going to happen, right? Because we can't just read one verse and then just write everything off. We have to consider the immediate context, and figure out what it truly means, right? So continuing on, I'll just read verse 14 again. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the old covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. So whatever veil you have, if you have a veil on, if you have some kind of veil which seems to be some kind of hardening, because it says their minds were hardened. It seems to represent the same thing as hardening, is what it seems. Or maybe it's a judgment for hardening. I don't know. Like, because when it says their minds were hardened, that probably means that's something that they did to themselves. They chose to harden their hearts or harden their minds, right? Talking about the Israelites. And so, is it something they did? Is it something God did? Hey, it's unclear in this case. In this case, at least at the moment. Perhaps there are clarifying passages in chapter 2. I don't know. But yeah, so it says yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. That's verse 15. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now notice it says you are turning to the Lord before the veil is removed. Why? Because it says, once again, in verse 4 of chapter 4, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And we believe, it seems that is the same veil when you're blinded. Now, I could be wrong, so that this is why we have to figure this out. We're just going to continue reading and figure this out, because there are no chapters and verses in the Bible. In reality, these are just words here to help us. These are just sections here to help us section things off, or to reference where things are. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is a spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So whatever is going on, right? I think I need to carefully read through verse 18 again, just to make sure I understand it properly, right? And we all, with unveiled face, so your face is already unveiled, beholding the glory of the Lord, right, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So it seems after you've already had an unveiled face, you're beholding the glory of the Lord, and you're being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So basically, you're being glorified, like you're basically reaching more and more glory, um, and that part is by the Spirit. It does not say anything about in verse 16, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. It doesn't say anything about the Spirit doing the removing the veil, like it doesn't say anything about the Spirit making you turn to the Lord. It just says the veil is removed. Perhaps you can say that we can say that the Spirit removes the veil. I mean, that's fine. That's I think that's a typical Arminian approach to that. But it does not seem to say that the veil is removed in order to turn to the Lord. It says you turn to the Lord in order for the veil to be removed. Like when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So turning to the Lord precedes the veil being removed. So even in one's hardened, veiled state, one can turn to the Lord. According to chapter 3, verse 16. That seems to be what it's saying. So how do we make that mesh with what it says in chapter 4? Let's just continue reading, right? Let's read it on again now that we have some context. You turn to the Lord, and then the veil is removed, right? Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, who does not lose heart, right? So we read verse 18, for this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit, talking about, moving from glory to glory. And therefore, having this ministry, because he established that he has a ministry and it's by the Spirit and not by the letter, right? He established that. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, right? But we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience. Notice it says everyone's conscience in the sight of God, right? And even if our gospel is veiled, there goes that word veiled again. So there's you being veiled, and then there's the gospel of being veiled is seemingly what's being happening here. Now perhaps Paul is using generic language. He may not be attributing it to one, like it's the actual gospel, or attributing it to an actual person in this case. I'm not sure, but we're gonna find out, right? Sometimes like Paul just uses very generic language, and he's not meaning to make a very distinct theological stance on a word, and like he's just saying words, and he's communicating a general point, right? So we have to be careful with these things. I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm not saying that I'm wrong. I'm just saying that sometimes we just simply use words, and they have a general meaning and people want to pick out words and all the time. Even I do that. I know I'm guilty of that. So I just want to point that out, right? And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. Now, those who are perishing is what it's saying. So whatever is going on, right? The gospel is somehow veiled, or the person is veiled. it says veil to those who are perishing, I guess as in like they can't see it, right? So if you're perishing, you can't see the gospel, you can't hear the gospel, because for whatever reason, right? You're in a state where you are perishing, as in like you are on the track to condemnation. You're on the track to hell, essentially. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers. So those who are perishing, he's calling them unbelievers, and he's saying that the God of this world has blinded them. And he's also saying that they have a veil over them. Now, here's something interesting. Remember, going back to chapter 3, verse 14, it says, "But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted." So, first, this is talking about the Israelites, the Jews, and how to that concurrent day, when Paul is talking about it, if they read the law, their minds, their their minds are hardened and they have a veil. So they can't see the revelation, that they can't see essentially what the Spirit is doing. They can't see what is really going on. They're hearing the law, like they're hearing the Old Covenant, and they're just sticking to that Old Covenant. And it seems that this is a choice, or either that, or they're in some kind of hardened state, right? That is what's happening to the Israelites in this case. They're talking about the Jews in this case, right? And so when we go up or down, whatever, right? When we read further on, the gospel is veiled to those who are perishing, and those who are perishing are identified as unbelievers. Who are the unbelievers in this case? Well, we just saw that Paul said that those who are listening to the Old Covenant, like when the Old Covenant is read, that those who hear it are hardened and they're veiled. So if they're hardened and they're veiled, then that means maybe they're the unbelievers. And then it says they can turn to the Lord and that veil will be removed. So let's go back and have that help us to interpret what chapter 4 is saying. Going back to verse 3 again. "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world, Satan, or whoever that is, has blinded the minds of the unbelievers, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." So the gospel is veiled, right? It says the gospel is veiled to unbelievers. It says that the Old Covenant, when the Old Covenant is read, the minds of the Israelites are veiled. So we can make some kind of connection here. Israelites, veiled. Unbelievers, veiled. Right? And so I think it's safe to say, I think it's something good to say that in this time that the Israelites were hardened. It says they were hardened, and so because they were hardened, they're veiled from seeing the truth, like from the gospel. Why? Because they're hearing the old covenant. Why? Because the God of this world has blinded their minds to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. So who is this about? Jews. This is not about everybody. This is about Jews, the Jews of the old covenant, who were delighting in the, remember, Paul said the letter, and he said the letter kills. The letter is the law, the old covenant, right? The letter kills, but the Spirit brings life. The letter kills, the Spirit brings life. Death, life. Hardened, not hardened. Veiled, unveiled. But it's saying that there's something in the middle where you have to turn to the Lord in order so you are over here, Jew, you like Israelite, you are veiled, hardened, and in the old covenant. But if you turn to the Lord, somewhere in the middle here, you turn to the Lord, then that veil is removed and you're over here. Now, it doesn't say how, right? It doesn't say how that happens. It just says that you just turn to the Lord. Whenever you turn to the Lord, the veil is removed. So I'm not making a case here necessarily for one, being able to believe apart from the Spirit regenerating them. But in my conversation with the Arminians, when he read this, he only read chapter 4. He only read chapter 4. He was talking specifically, he was using chapter 4, verse 4, in order to say that everybody is an unbeliever, right? And everybody is veiled, everybody is being blinded by Satan, and the only solution to that is for the Spirit to do a work in order to remove those blinders. But that's just not in the text, right? That's not the text. I think we have to establish that. We have to be very clear. It does not say that in this text, at least. Maybe you could say it in somewhere else, but in this text, it doesn't say that, right? And so I think it's safe to say that, one, if you are veiled, even if this applied to more than just Jews, which I'm fine if it does, right? Even if this applied to more than just Jews, it still says that the solution in chapter 3, verse 16, is to turn to the Lord, and then the veil is removed. So it's giving some imperative here that you have to turn to the Lord in order for the veil to be removed. But until then, you are hardened and you are under the veil. It doesn't say that you're beyond hope. It doesn't say that you can't turn to the Lord. It just says that you have a veil. And it doesn't say that the veil is completely removing your ability to believe or anything. So all it's saying is you are under the old covenant. So how do you get from being under the old covenant to the new covenant? From being under the letter to under the Spirit, the law to the Spirit, the law to grace. You turn to the Lord. So I think that's my assessment, and I think that's how we have to handle this text. I don't think we can read all these concepts into it. We just look at what the text says and say, like, hey, what was Paul's point here? What was he trying to do? He was very clear that you turn to the Lord before the veil is removed. And what is that veil? whatever that veil is, it seems to be blinding you in some kind of way, but not fully. It's not beyond, you're not beyond reach, you're not beyond repair, even um, even when Paul is saying that it's veiled to those who are perishing, right? Those who are perishing are those who are going or who are already not believing, intentionally not believing. That means they've removed, they've chosen. In my opinion, those who are perishing are already those who are unbelievers, and those who are unbelievers, in this case, have already heard the gospel message and they rejected it. And therefore, because their hearts are hardened and they want to stick to this old covenant, they want to stick to the letter, to the law, they are being blinded. And they can't see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. I think that, in my opinion, that seems to be a viable interpretation. I don't mind being corrected on certain points, but I think the overall emphasis on this is that it is very clear that you can turn to the Lord in order for the veil to be removed. It does not say the veil is removed in order for you to turn to the Lord. That is not the case, right? It says you turn to the Lord, then the veil is removed. It does not say the Spirit removes the veil in order for you to turn to the Lord. Or it does not say the Spirit removes the blinders of Satan in order for you to believe. It just says you turn to the Lord. It just says that. So, and Paul is saying they would commend themselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. When he's talking about the practices, the way that they go about preaching the gospel, which, by the way, I think this is a great way to talk about evangelism and how we should never use deceptive practices for evangelism. I think this is a tangent here, but I think that if you are going to evangelize to somebody, you should try to be as straightforward as possible. Don't do a bait and switch. Like I remember I was part of a campus ministry, and I went to this event. We were invited to this event, and it was just saying that it's going to be like some kind of dance party or something like that. So, we and our my campus ministry, we decided to go to this event because we knew that there were going to be Christians there, which is cool. That's fine. Some of them are dancers. That's cool. That's fine. We went there. It was in the auditorium, which like everybody was sitting down, and some bleachers. We're just like, hold on, how are we all supposed to dance in here, right? And it did not talk about, at least from what I understand, in the flyer. Maybe the flyer was not made by them. I don't know. But whatever it was, we went there and these guys showed up. They showed us some really cool dance moves, I guess. And then after that, some speaker came on and was just like, all right, we're going to talk to you guys. Basically, she started spitting, it was a woman, she started spitting a sermon at us. And I was already a Christian at that point, but I was a little upset. Why? Because I was there with like some students who were not believers, and I was trying to help. I was intentionally, working myself into their lives, in many ways, and trying to evangelize to them. And I did not want them to show up to a sermon or whatever that they were not prepared for, and hear some things that they were not ready to hear yet. So I was like, many of the leaders in that organization at that time, we were upset because we were just like, hey, we weren't even prepared for this. You told us this is a dance party, but then you said, you gave us like 15 minutes of dancing. None of us got to dance, and then you decided to throw like a 30-40 minute sermon at us. And then we decided to walk out. We walked out because it was a deceptive practice. It's not, you can preach the gospel, but what Paul says here is we refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And sorry, I forgot to read this part. We have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. That is underhanded. That is underhanded. You cannot do a bait and switch. That is not okay, right? So we should be careful with the way that we present the gospel, especially to those that we have never seen before. And I'm not talking about you water down your message. I'm talking about the way that you bring about yourself preaching the gospel. You should be open about things. You should, like, if you're a pastor, if you're whatever else, like, unless you're in some country that is like oppressing you, you have no reason to just be all super like on the down low and start saying so, try to be deceptive. Like, unless you're protecting your identity, like, there's no reason for you to so that you can survive. Like, there's no reason for you to have such deceptive practices. So we should be open about things. We should be clear about things, and say, like, hey, I'm going to be doing, like, this is what we're going to do. Going to do this to this time, this to this time, this to this time. If you like, we invite you to be in all of that. And if you don't want to be in all of that, that's completely fine. That's your choice, right? But we can't just like throw a sermon on somebody without the, like, out of nowhere. And then what's even worse is when some of us left, she started speaking bad about us, and calling us like all kinds of crazy names. So anyways, I said it would be a tangent, and it was, but I just want to be clear that, like, people, like, it says unbelievers, right? Like, the minds of unbelievers are blinded. Who are those unbelievers? I believe this referring directly about Jews here, because Paul, in literally the very paragraph right before that, he was talking specifically about the Jews, about the Israelites, and about Moses, in the Old Covenant, and how the Old Covenant was keeping them veiled, because they are being yoked to the law. They are being yoked to the letter, and it is keeping them hardened. It is keeping them dead, because remember, it says the letter kills. It's keeping them hardened, keeping them dead. It's keeping them veiled, and they need to turn to the Lord in order for that veil to be removed. In the same way it says in chapter 4, unbelievers are perishing, so dead, and they're blinded, in other words, veiled, or the gospel itself is veiled to them. And the solution is turning to the Lord. I think that's just how it is. All right, see you guys later.